Coming up on 1 minute. Mark, T-minus 60 seconds and counting. We are go for Apollo 7 at this time.
Emergence of the Breakaway Civilization by Walter Bosley. You will enjoy this.
Alrighty, hello. In the spirit of my talk, I came here with 19th century technology on the train, and that was quite an adventure. So let me, oh, there, I'm up there already. That's pretty good. Yeah, I guess that's kind of a clunky title, the 19th, well, this one's better, the 19th century development and emergence, 20th century breakaway civilizations. Those are my credentials up there for those of you who don't know who I am or what I was or this, that, or the other. So I'm going to jump right in. What I'm going to do here today is basically introduce a lot of you to some material that you've probably never heard of or never really thought was connected with the breakaway civilizations and such that we're talking about, because a lot of what we talk about is here at this event is 20th century and now 21st century, and some folks had no idea that this stuff has its origins over 150 years ago. It was startling to me when I realized how much. So let's proceed. Now, the first point I want to make is, as you see, the breakaway civilization, as popularly discussed, is not the product of Nazi Germany. It is not the product of the post-World War II military-industrial complex. And it is not the product of reverse engineering of an ET craft. However, I think all three of these things are the product of the 19th century breakaway emergence, as I like to refer to it. And I'm going to present to you some evidence on that, and only 3 lines of evidence. The evidence I'll be presenting, as you can see, have to do with Germans, money, and technology, because this is where I have found the threads that tie all this 19th century stuff to what we're talking about today here in 2015. Let us start with the Germans. The 20th century breakaway civilizations would not have happened without the mysterious airship Nimsa. Who were the Nimsa? Where did we hear about them first? And what's the German connection? Well, the secret development of airship technology pursued in the 19th century by a Prussian nationalist cabal, and that's a very specific thing now. They called themselves Nimsa, is the source of the emergence of secret space programs that we're talking about this weekend. And as you can see, in my opinion, in my research, I have found where they have existed since, well, there's 2 groups. The American group, I think, has existed since the post-Civil War era, and the German group, which existed prior to. So, what is this Nimsa? In my opinion, Nimsa, NYMZA, which is the word we were given by Charles Dellschau, who we will talk about, is a transliteration. You can see that word up there. Now, what is a transliteration? For those of you who haven't studied linguistics or a foreign language or anything, a transliteration is essentially when you want to convey the proper pronunciation of a word in one language by a proper pronunciation of a word in one language by speakers of a different language. And what you commonly do is take the alphabet used by the speakers that you're aiming that transliteration at, you use their alphabet and their pronunciations to pronounce the word in the original language. So therefore, what that means is The spelling, the actual spelling of that original word is not the spelling of the transliteration, okay? So therefore, in this particular case, Nimza, as it's written in the source material, which I'll get into, is actually, in my opinion, NJMZ small a, also pronounced Nimza. Now, as I stated, this came from a gentleman named Charles Dellschau, and he always spelled it in capital letters. Well, now, capital letters imply an acronym very often, and I think that is so in the case of the Nimza, which Dellschau from the very beginning said was headquartered in Germany. Well, why is that important? Well, over the years, folks that have researched the airship mysteries, which we'll also be getting into further, they've tried to translate Nimza. Well, what could this possibly be? What was this organization? And there was a little bit of confusion because Charles Dellschau was talking about a group in the 1850s, the decade prior to the U.S. Civil War. And he applied this Nimza to that era. But in the 1890s, in the material about the airship mystery of 1896 and 97, Nimza comes up, and also the mention of investors, secret investors from the East or New York specifically. So therefore, it was very common to want to translate NYMZA Nimza to mean New York something or other. And the most common one, the one I think was a pretty good try, was the New York Motor Zephyr Association. And a lot of the translations of Nimza got stuck on the NY and this information from 40 years later about New York investors. So they assumed that NY had to have meant New York, New York, New York, something or other. Well, when you go back to Dellschau, who himself was a German immigrant, he had insisted, it said originally, that Nimza was headquartered in Germany. It was a German organization. So I thought to myself, okay, the translation should come from the German language, in my opinion. So this is how I came up with this spelling of Nimza. What does it mean? You guys can all hear me good, right? Okay. Well, after several hours and looking at things, all the possibilities, and with a lot of help from friends more familiar with the German language than I, who also had assistance from German native speakers, I came up with, as you can see, the Nationalistisch Jagdflugzeug Maschinenzahlungsamt. And pardon my German pronunciation if it's not too good. So what does this mean, right? These were the German words that these helpers I had, some German natives, said were a good fit for what I was trying to convey. So what it means in literal translation, nationalistisch is nationalist, and that's important to make that distinction. It's nationalist, not national. Remember, national would imply that it's official in some type of government capacity, right? Nationalist is a little bit more specific. And we'll be talking about who these nationalists were momentarily. Jagdflugzeug, if I'm pronouncing that right, literally means hunting/flying object, okay? And Maschinen, of course, machines, and Zahlungsamt, payment office or department. Well, that's kind of clunky. Nationalist, hunting, flying object, machines, payment office, blah, 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 blah. Wow, okay, that's a mouthful. So how would we put that in today's vernacular? Now, being an Air Force officer and being around that world, I know how the language goes there, and I know how we would translate this to be a little more understandable to what we're talking about here. And this is what I came up with. Nationalist, that's pretty easy. Hunting flying object. Based on what I knew in my research and what this organization was about, I determined that hunting flying object really means what we would call pursuit exploration, okay? And machines, we would refer to, we'd be a little more specific. We wouldn't say machines. We're talking about flying objects here, so airship, okay? And we would call it a program office. Those of you who've worked in program development in the military will recognize that phrase, program office. So from this lead from Dellschau, that this was a German organization, and from the material talking about flying objects dating back to the 1850s, I came up with the Nationalist Pursuit Exploration Airship Program Office. Still kind of clunky, but a little more clear. So who were these guys exactly? They were, as I state here, a distinctly Prussian nationalist organization dedicated to unified Germany's global superiority in active pursuit of influence and exploitation of the natural resources and industry of the Americas. That's the kind of phrasing they teach you when you go through officer training school and how to, title a program. You got to come up with, what are we about? Global power. And this really, in my opinion, encapsulates who we're talking about. And as you shall see, that's what these guys were about, exactly what you see right here. Now, going back to the 1850s, there was no Germany, okay? What there were several Prussian states. And in this particular era, the mid-19th century, they were really pushing for unification, okay? So it was the early days of nationalism, all right? So what that means is that NIMZA was actually a private group, not a national group, because there was no German nation, right? There was no national Germany. So this was a private group that was made up of German nationalists dedicated to a unified Germany, okay? So that's where the nationalist distinction is very important here, okay? So again, where did we learn about NIMZA to begin with? Charles A. Dellschau, German immigrant, born in Brandenburg, Prussia in 1830, died just over in Houston, Texas on the 20th of April, interesting date, 1923. Now, it is possible that he was sent to California as sort of a spy, if you will, for the NIMZA organization to report back on the activities of this Sonora Aero Club. This is where it starts getting fun. We all hope, right? There he is. There's Charles Dellschau. Now, one of the important reasons I'm showing you the photos here is when you read about this stuff, a lot of it is, names on a page, and it reads like apocryphal tales. People are like, what is this, flying machines in the 1850s that weren't balloons? Are you kidding? This Dellschau character, well, there's a photograph of him. He's a real flesh and blood guy. He lived, and that's him. He went to California in Tuolumne County, where there's the gold country there, and he went to Sonora, the little village of Columbia, and Jamestown up there, and he later in life wrote about this Sonora Aero Club, this group of German immigrants, there's a foot stopper, who were building all these secretive flying machines. So let's talk about them a little bit. As I said, a secretive group primarily of and led by German immigrants. There were a few Italians in there. And these guys designed, built, and flew, as I state, rudimentary contraptions. They called them arrows, and they flew them all around the countryside up there, just west of Yosemite. And this was in the 1850s, okay, in the decade before our Civil War. And this was all done under the aegis of this German organization, NIMZA. Okay, NIMZA was like they were the program office, as I said before. So they were the ones who were supplying certain resources and would watch the progress of these various groups. And we only know of the groups, we only know of the group in California through Dellschau. But even Dellschau refers to other groups in the US, and there could have been around the world. But in this particular case, we know about the Sonora Aero Club, meaning Sonora, California, of course, in the 1850s. This is an example of one of the arrows. Now, later in life, in the 1890s, Dellschau started doing these drawings and paintings of these things. And he did several books of them. They've become kind of legendary. And at first glance, people say, they kind of chuckle a little bit, and they go, are you serious, really? You know, what the heck? It's important to note that this dome shape here, okay, that's not a balloon. Okay, these are not balloons. Keep that in mind. Again, here's another one. This up here, these are not balloons. Okay. And again, these were the things that were being built in the 1850s and using a very interesting propulsion system. There's another one. You would almost think that. You got to wonder, you know, he didn't really explain certain things. Now, we're going to get into a little bit. This is the motor up here, the motor area up here. And I'll be getting into that a little bit more. Here's another one. As you can see, there was even a big spotlight, which is real important when you get into the 1890s era. They talk about the spotlights. And if you can look at the bottom here, you see this figure with the beard and the red shirt. That's a depiction, always depicted the same way, okay, the same clothes and such. That's a depiction of the man named Peter Menes. Peter Menes was the German immigrant who was the leader of the Sonora Aero Club. Very important figure in all of this. Take a look at this one. Now, again, the 1850s, okay? And look at these wheels. Now, this, of course, is, those of you who are engineers and such, I guess, you know, this is what the wheel looks like. This is in one position, but as you can see down here, this is another position that the wheel would, so it kind of moves. And the wheels, they're part of a magnetic type of device. We're talking about anti-gravity in the 1850s, okay? And that's what all these wheels represent. That's what these wheels would do. They would serve that purpose. And also for forward and reverse motion. These things did not, by the way, just go up and down. They went up and then they went forward and reverse and made turns, and they were very maneuverable, much more than balloons. Now, we're talking about the German line of evidence for the connection from the 1850s NIMSA up to the modern times, so we'll continue with that. I quote Dellschau here. At one point, he, in his diaries about all this, mentions that Prussian officer. At one point, it appears that NIMSA sent a Prussian nationalist representative, military representative, to talk the group into developing these arrows for military uses, okay, for the NIMSA. And they didn't want any part of that. It was interesting. The Sonora Aero Club, even though they were working originally under the aegis of NIMSA, they seemed to reject that idea. And that becomes important when we talk about the emergence of the American group. Now, what's interesting is that guy in the red shirt I showed you, it wasn't long after they said to the Prussian representative of NIMSA that, no, we're not interested in developing this for military uses, that he dies in an accident. And we're told that he took the secret of the aerotechnology to the grave, and the club dissolved, and Dellschau departed California and returned here to Texas, where he lived the rest of his life. Peter Menes was the one who understood the technology that made these things fly best. And he was the one who had the secret to their fuel. They used a particular fuel in their process. And, you know, we are to assume, based on Dellschau, that that was it. When Menes died, As I state, he took it with him and it was no more. We'll learn otherwise. So what happened after the dissolution of the Sonora Aero Club in the 1850s? Well, we watch the development of, pushing towards unified German Empire. Between 1862 and 1888, we see the rise of the Second Reich and all these historical things that we know about, the internal conflict. In 1881, Kaiser Wilhelm II fired Otto von Bismarck, and he got even heavier. He pushed Germany into an even heavier nationalism, put Germany on the gold standard, greatly began to expand the military, and increased colonization and mining activity in South America. Now, this should all look familiar to you because, one Reich leads to the next. And, this is the beginnings of what we see with the Nazis later in the 20th century, of course. So let's look at the activity of the NIMZA in South America, with Germany doing these things and being more active in, let me go back, in the colonization aspects, especially in the mining. Between 1871 and 1914 was the major period of known German immigration into Argentina. That's interesting. 1871 is when it started. Germany, of course, being on the gold standard, and what do you know, as I said before, they were getting heavily into mining. They were looking for sources of gold, right? They were on the gold standard. They needed more of the stuff. This was also the period of South American gold rushes. So it all makes sense. When you look at the historical stuff, it's all logical. And embedded in all that is the NIMZA doing their thing. And wouldn't you know it, there were airship sightings during this period. 1868, Copiapo, Chile. 1880, Venezuela. In 1897, I add the Texas sighting in Greenville because the pilot tells the witness that if he helps him deliver some mail or give them some water for their motor, that he'll take him on a trip to South America, and bring him back, presumably the same day. 1897, okay? So here we have, coincidentally, all this airship activity going on while Germany, the Second Reich, is down there being really active in South America. And it was in the South America thread that I discovered something that really came out of nowhere and startled me, but just made too much sense. And it has to do with these two guys. E.H. Harriman, the legendary president and owner of the Union Pacific Railroad, and the guy next to him, Robert Leroy Parker, also known as Butch Cassidy. What the heck did they have to do with each other? Well, let me see here. Okay. I had switched some slides out, so pardon me for going back and forth. Here's the interesting thing. The Hole-in-the-Wall gang was the most successful train robbing and sometimes bank robbing group in the United States up until the Dalton gang, okay? Nobody could catch these guys. They'd get in, they'd get out. Nobody could catch them. We all have seen, well, most of us have seen the movie, and we're familiar with the famous posse always chasing them around the West, right? The Pinkerton guys. But no matter how much they tried, they could never catch them. Well, in 1899, Parker decided he wanted amnesty. He wanted to change his life, okay? So he goes to Governor Wells of Utah to discuss amnesty. Wells tells him that he really needs to go talk to the man he's been stealing the most from, E.H. Harriman. Now, at the same time, in the same period, we know that E.H. Harriman was interested in offering Parker, Butch Cassidy, amnesty. That's a lesser known part of the story, but it is part of history. Harriman wanted to give him amnesty. He even sent Matt Warner, who was a former outlaw turned lawman, to convey this message to Cassidy. So here we have in 1899, the most famous train robber wanting amnesty. And here we have the guy who can grant it to him, wanting to give it to him. But you talk to any Western historian, and they'll stomp their foot, and they'll tell you, nope, didn't happen. Nope, Cassidy never met with Harriman, never discussed amnesty at all. Never happened. He just went on being an outlaw. And they'll insist on that. When you look deeper at the facts, that doesn't make sense. Because a funny thing happened after this period that we're told no meeting between Harriman and Butch Cassidy took place. In 1901, Butch, his friend Sundance, and their pal Etta Place, well, what do? They go down to South America. They have no trouble getting through immigration, which even back then, you know, there was administrivia. This was not an easy thing to do. But they had no trouble. And they just happened to have the cash on them to buy 15,000 acres of choice property in the Chubut province, the little town area called Cholila, which, as you can see, is about a little over 100 miles south of a place that's really interesting to us today, San Carlos de Bariloche, the future Nazi refuge. So let's look at this again. We have all this German activity. NIMSA, as I pointed out, looks like they're active in South America and have been for 30 years. And here we have E.H. Harriman of the Union Pacific Railroad and Butch Cassidy. And, you know, we're told they never met, but they wanted to meet. And then we have Butch and his pals going down there and doing all this stuff in Argentina, buying a ranch, blah, 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 so forth. This is why I titled this The Arrangement, because in my opinion, Butch Cassidy did meet with E.H. Harriman. And I think that an arrangement, a deal, so to speak, was made. It's interesting, after this period that Cassidy expressed the desire for amnesty, the gang only robbed a Union Pacific train one more time. They never touched another UP train again. And then, the gang that could never be caught, that could do no wrong, never screw up, suddenly they could do no right. They would go on heists or robberies, and the law would be there already, okay? They would find a posse coming around the corner. They would get in shootouts. And what's further interesting about that is that increasingly, Butch, even though he would design the heist and plan it, he would not go with them. He would send the gang to go do it, and disaster would happen. Another thing about Butch Cassidy people in the movies don't realize is he was never known to have killed anybody. Neither was Sundance. Here you have two legendary outlaws robbing trains and banks. And, you know, the movies depict them rootin' tootin' the Old West, right? And members of their gang, particularly during this bad era that started happening for them, they were getting in shootouts and killing lawmen. But Butch and Sundance, when you actually look at the facts, were never known to kill anybody. Now, I spent a few years in federal law enforcement, and when I read this, when I learned about this, I'm looking at all these facts, and I'm thinking, the guys in a gang, a criminal gang, who are involved in all this robbery and stuff, but they're the only ones who don't shoot at and certainly don't kill anybody, or at least, you know, no law enforcement or anyone. In my mind, that's the undercover operative. So what did this mean about Butch and Sundance and our friends? Well, let's go back momentarily to where they built their ranch. Now, as you can see, let's see, is this working? Yeah, there's Argentina, the big picture. So you get there's San Carlos de Bariloche. The red star is where their ranch was. That was where the Butch Cassidy ranch was. And as you can see, here's Bariloche up here, and just, go a little south, and there was this ranch they set up in 1901, okay? That's what the countryside looks like. So you can see the Andean mountains there. So how is it that this Old West train robber and E.H. Harriman of the Union Pacific Railroad, who, if they made some type of arrangement. Why was the arrangement for Butch and his friends to go down to this particular spot and establish a ranch? What's going on here? And at the same time, we have this German organization operating in South America. Could there be a connection? In my opinion, the story of these three has not completely been told. I've told you about Butch and Sundance. Sundance Kid, Harry Longabaugh, was a known expert marksman. Again, an expert marksman in a criminal gang that is, he doesn't shoot at anybody, hasn't killed anybody. In my mind, coming from my perspective as a former federal agent, he's the cop. He's the undercover agent. And the lady in the corner had an even more amazing story, which I get into in my book, Empire of the Wheel 2, Friends from Sonora. She herself, the evidence suggests to me, was neither Sundance's girlfriend nor wife. She was a secular nun who was co-opted by the U.S. Secret Service. There's something you never knew about Etta Place, right? Okay, and I think she lies buried today under a different name, where she was murdered by probably foreign agents in San Bernardino, California in 1915. But that's another story. But these are the three. These three went down to South America and established this ranch in future Nazi refuge territory. So what does this have to do with Germans? We'll get to that in the money thread. But first, let's look at some more Germans. If you're trying to identify who the German nationalists would be that would back and support and really be this NIMSA, there are I think, some obvious possibilities in German history. And we'll start with Karl Reichenbach, who lived from the late 18th century through the Sonora Aero Club era and into 1869. Now, he was a chemist, he was a geologist, a metallurgist, a general industrialist, and he was a philosopher member of the Prussian Academy of Sciences. It's basically what you've got here is the classic philosopher-scientist, as the British used to put it, that of the type that founded the Royal Society, okay, and who ran the Royal Society up until 1830, when the bean counters and the tech weenies got control of the society, and they didn't want those alchemists or those hermeticists running anything. He was of that stripe. He would have been the type of guy who would have said, yeah, NIMSA, this is a good idea. Karl Kellner is another likely suspect as far as being one of the movers and shakers of this secret NIMSA group. Again, you see a chemist, an inventor, an industrialist, and a mystic, founder of the OTO, which Aleister Crowley would be, and others be famously involved with it. Kellner's the kind of German guy, nationalist, who would have been all for and involved with making, he would have been in the era of continuing it from its early days into the early 20th century, okay? He would have bridged that gap between the Sonora Aero Club days through the airship mysteries of the 1890s. Friedrich Woniek, as you can see, another one who bridges the gap between the 19th century into the 20th century, right? Again, here we have, he was an iron and engineering industrialist. Again, these are the kind of guys that would have had the means, right, the material resources and such, and the know-how to build these airships. And again, he was a mystic and an ardent nationalist. Remember, nationalist is the first word in NIMSA. Then, of course, we have this guy, Walter Rathenau, and he's really definitely one to bridge the late 19th century airship era directly to the Nazis. An engineer, an industrialist, chemist, and philosopher, there we go again, the philosopher-scientist. He was chairman of AEG. Now, that should be familiar to you readers of Joseph Farrell's work, because AEG has been directly connected with the Bell, the Nazi Bell. Mr. Rathenau was also an ardent nationalist, and in my opinion, he would have been, in his era, late 19th century into the 20th century, definitely a suspect for NIMSA membership, as it were, or management. Then we have this guy, finally, Helmer Schacht, and he very definitely bridges this 19th century milieu to the Nazis. Politician and banker, member of the Urania Lodge, There we have the mystics again, and he had started out as a supporter for Adolf Hitler, but history tells us that that sort of, kind of changed, maybe. And Schacht, of course, as a banker, did some pretty interesting things that have already been talked about here today and will continue to be, I'm sure. So let's review what we have here in this German thread. We started with this Prussian nationalist period. We have Dellschau, a German immigrant, talking about NIMSA, a German organization, overseeing the Sonora Aero Club, a group of German immigrants. Okay, and this is the era in which Reichenbach would have been, part of running NIMSA and been influential in it. Okay, so there's a historical connection there to you. Then we move into the era of the Second Reich, industrialists and mystics. In this period, we have Germans into South America. We have a German banker, who you will learn, connected to Harriman, and the whole bit with the Cassidy Ranch in Argentina. And of course, we have the airship sightings in South America, and this is the period, as you can see, of Kellner, Waniek, Rathenau, and Schacht. Okay, just to put it in a historical perspective with these guys. Leading into the Third Reich, Rathenau and AEG, and then eventually the Nazi Bell, and then Schacht, of course. So, let's proceed to the money thread. Who might these Prussian NIMSA investors have been? Okay, during this period, the Prussian nationalists were looking to unify Germany, and they were looking for their national identity. So they saw railroads as a means to support both the creation of the national identity and then the obvious, greater ease of military buildup. And so therefore, you would have, the bankers that would be involved in industry, and particularly railroads and such. So which German banks existed that could have backed an organization like NIMSA with this effort? We start with Brandenburg, established in the 16th century. It is the world's second oldest bank. It had branches, it started out with branches in Portugal, Italy, and London. Okay, that's a foot stomper for those of you familiar with Dr. Farrell's work on the banksters. Portugal was a haven for the Knights Templar. King Denis, during the persecution, had made Portugal a place where they could hide out. He founded the Order of Christ, and he said, all you Knights Templars, you're now in the Order of Christ. So Portugal, again, was the place that the Templars were, and of course we know their connection to European banking and such, right? And of course, interesting that Portugal would be a part of, with Prince Henry, the whole secret trips to the Americas thing. And Italy, of course, that should be the obvious one. Venice was there, and London, by extension, was part of the whole bankster milieu. And there's Brandenburg right there. And they were around for a couple of centuries by the time we're aware of NIMSA. And interestingly enough, they were deeply involved in North American trade and finance. So they were, in their early days, interested in, being over here. And let's go down the list here. You have Metzler, around since the 17th century. You have Trinkhaus and Burkhardt, which is now under HSBC. Look at when these banks were established. They've been around a long time, okay? Saul Oppenheim, 18th century. The family was married into the Rothschilds by 1834. Abraham Oppenheim was a buddy of Wilhelm I. This is the same Oppenheim family from which sprung Max Oppenheim, who very much involved with Nazi issues. Isn't that interesting? And the list goes on. Hauken Aufhäuser, Donner, and Ruschel. M.M. Warburg, that name again should be familiar to you because there are the European Warburgs and the American Warburgs in international banking and such. Berliner Sparkasse, and on. As you can see, these banks were around, and they were there, and any one of them, if not all of them. As you can see, shipping is important to many of them. Any one of them or all of them could have been involved in financial and material support of NIMZA. But we move on. In the post-Aero Club era, going into the 1860s, we have the death of Menace in the alleged dissolution. But again, this German banking thread finds its connection to South America, I think. And at the same time, it's important to know that an American airship group was just beginning to emerge. Okay, and we're gonna come back to who these guys were shortly. But during this time, I think the NIMZA began to really focus more on South America. Which brings us back to this place, which evidence suggests was a refuge for this guy. You know, look, the happy bird on his shoulder, just it's one big party. And that's a big view of Bariloche there, okay? That's what it looks like. Wonderful real estate. Kuhn Loeb, many of you have heard of them. Established in 1867 here in the United States. The founder was Abraham Kuhn, a German immigrant. At one time, his bank, he owned 64% of all railroad lines in the U.S., just as it says up there. And had close ties to those Warburgs, both the American ones and the German ones. Now, what's important about Kuhn Loeb is that he, in my opinion, marks the beginning of a NIMZA-allied banker, which is actually an American established organization, established here in the States, okay? But yet, very German in its alliances to NIMZA, in my opinion. There he is right there, Abraham Kuhn. And how does he connect to all this? Directly. Well, what do you know? Kuhn Loeb was a rail baron banker. It was Kuhn Loeb when E.H. Harriman spent an exorbitant amount of money to purchase the Union Pacific that supplied Harriman with his capital. Okay? Kuhn Loeb made it possible for Harriman to buy and run the Union Pacific Railroad. So you have to ask yourself, the amnesty that Butch wanted, the deal, the arrangement I was talking about earlier. They go down to South America and on, et cetera, and we find out that this particular German banker was Harriman's guy, or Harriman was his guy, actually. Let's look at this connection here more visually to make it clear. Kuhn Loeb at the top there, there's Harriman with his Union Pacific. Butch, Sundance, and Etta go down and establish the ranch, future Nazi refuge. Okay? That's the line that I've put together. I think that that's what's behind Butch, Sundance, and Etta going down to South America. And as you can see, Kuhn Loeb ties the 19th century milieu we're talking about here with these Germans and with the money up to the 20th century with the Nazis, okay? And that puts it in, I hope, a clear perspective of connection. Abraham Kuhn and his company was involved in financing Westinghouse, okay? Westinghouse, of course, famously backed and employed Nikola Tesla. So there you have Kuhn connected to financing Tesla technology, ostensibly. Kuhn's company, his bank, was behind Western Union. Now that's important because Western Union, was started out as a telegraph company. Telegraphy is very important in this airship technology, in my opinion. And railroaders, telegraph companies were established hand in hand with railroads, okay? So they were often formed by railroad companies. Kuhn-Loeb had connections to, he was a banker to the Rockefellers, and he was involved, Abraham Kuhn was involved with Chase Bank, okay? And personally involved with Otto Kahn, the Warburgs, Jacob Schiff and his family, and Kuhn-Loeb also provided the government loans to foreign countries, specifically, Austria, Mexico, and Venezuela. Isn't that interesting? Again, as I said, though US-based, I believe that Kuhn-Loeb was a NIMSA ally. But let's continue on past the 1860s, because it does get more interesting even. I won't even try to pronounce the top one, but they were around since 1868. Then we come to Commerzbank, established in 1870, Germany's second largest. The first chairman was a shipping magnate, and Commerzbank would go on to be among the World War II Grossbanken that financed German military and wonderful organizations like IG Farben, Krups, and Siemens, the things they did during World War II. Of course, in the 21st century, they were involved with laundering $253 billion out of Iran, Sudan, and Myanmar. Now, when you think of the Nazi historical connection to Islamic Jihad, that makes that last one kind of interesting, I think. Then we come to these guys. Deutsche Bank, been around since 1870. Siemens, of the company I mentioned before, was a founder and director, okay? Among their first overseas ventures, South America. What a surprise, right? They were behind the founding of the Northern Pacific Railroad and the Baghdad Railway. So there they are. They're rail barons too. Pardon? Oh. They provided bonds to Krupp, and they were the ones who brought Bayer to the stock market. And Bayer, of course, Krupp was, of course, a munitions company, and Bayer was involved in human experimentation during World War II. Deutsche Bank was the bank of the Gestapo. They admitted to funding Auschwitz not too many years ago. They admitted to that, and IG Farben facilities that were in concentration camps. Now, I found this interesting. They were the first listing on the New York Stock Exchange after 9/11. That's kind of interesting to me. Their headquarters in Frankfurt is the Deutsche Bank Twin Towers, right? In honor of, No. The Deutsche Bank Twin Towers has been around since 1984. This is it. It was, we are told, it was originally built to be a Hyatt hotel, but then they backed out and Deutsche Bank said, we'll take it as our headquarters. That's the official story. So this has been their headquarters since '84. And I looked at that. I thought, that's kind of an interesting image there. See, I'm a Blue Lodge Mason, haven't been active in years, but when I saw that, I noticed that it looks remarkably like what's called a Dugard. Particular, as you can see, a stance. That's the Royal Master stance, but notice his feet, okay? He's got the heel in, the one foot's turned out and the one's down, and look over here. See that? This would be the legs, and this is the feet. The very building is a Masonic Dugard, it appears. And this is what we're talking about here, the position. So you see, if these are the feet, isn't that interesting? So, what are we to think about this? A bank to the Nazis, and they were around during this airship period. In 2001 to 2007, they were found to be committing corporate espionage. They were involved in the housing bubble and a CDO scandal. Now, an issuer of CDOs earns a commission and fees without any residual liability, okay? That means they can sell these CDO loans, and they make their profit, okay? And if it goes bad, they can just sell they sell the debt to someone else, and they make their profit, okay? Deutsche Bank was found to be pushing volume over quality. They were just pushing these. They didn't care if it was a bad bet, a bad loan. They were just pushing CDOs really hard. They were one of the major pushers of CDOs during this period of the building housing bubble, okay? And later, they sold off tons of these bad loans, making a profit, okay? Now, remember, look at the era. This is post 9/11, and it's leading right up to 2008 when everything fell apart. Just exactly how much in bad CDOs and bonds did Deutsche Bank push into the international market? $32 billion in these things. Aggressively marketed is the wording by the authorities, by Deutsche Bank between 2004 and 2008. Okay, now remember the bailout here in the States was only $8 billion. Now you might look at this and say, you know, like compared to our national debt and stuff in the trillions, you might say, oh, 32 billion, that's not that much. But, you know, I talked with a couple of professional bankers, and they assured me that $32 billion in bad debt like this injected into the economy in, you know, that period of 4 years would make some problems that would have contributed. And here you have Deutsche Bank, the former Nazi bank, doing this in the post 9/11 world. Okay, what does that mean? Well, I happen to subscribe to a theory that that Joseph Farrell has talked about. I mention him again. And, you know, I'm showing you a line here of Germans connected, these 19th century Germans, you know, involved with this secret technology organization leading into the early 20th century to the Nazis, okay? And, you know, it's not like they disappeared in World War II. In my opinion, I think the NIMSA, in many ways, were really, you know, they were behind the Nazis, definitely as supporters. And, you know, what was Deutsche Bank doing? Maybe they were just following up on what happened in 2001, doing their part for the continued blackmail, as it were, financial blackmail. But let's continue with the bankers, with the money trail. And we come to the American investors. Now, it's important to note that these American investors, I'm just showing you who might have been involved in this airship technology investment and development, whether they were allied to the American group, which I'll talk about, or the German group, we can't say for sure. Some of them might very well have been allied to the German group. But here you have Bank of New York. They financed wars. They were in engineering and industry. You have Brown Brothers Harriman. Oh, there's Harriman, that name. Around since the early 19th century, oldest and largest private bank in the U.S. Citibank of New York. Now, these banks are still around, by the way, most of them. Well, or in a different name. You know, Citibank of New York. Moses Taylor was a Astor protege, which becomes important later. And then, of course, you had Chemical Bank. Now, they started out as a chemical manufacturing company, and that's important when you talk about this technology. Okay, again, the tie is industry, technology, money, right? We go to Wells Fargo Bank. They were in transportation, express delivery, and telegraph. Okay, well, they would be interested in you know, airship finance, right? Now, I would place Wells Fargo with the American group that was emerging later on. Goldman Sachs. Henry Goldman was known to be a supporter of Germany right up until 1933 when he went to Berlin and learned about what the Germans were really doing, and then he came away disgusted, and it changed his position on them. Then we have Zions Bank. They were around during this airship period, established by Brigham Young. Okay, they were in the heart of the airship country, and due to the independent nature of Utah itself, I would say that, you know, Zions Bank might have said, hey, finance this airship group thing? Sure, why not? But let's look at the individuals now. J.P. Morgan, connected with, of course, today's J.P. Morgan Chase. He's the originator. Morgan formed General Electric and U.S. Steel. Okay, there's industry for you. Of course, to tell you what kind of guy he was, he paid $300 to somebody to take his place in the Civil War. And then he made money selling defective rifles to the U.S. Army. Great guy. Railroads, engineering, connection to the Rothschilds. And in fact, when the U.S. Treasury needed gold because they were short, he sold them some of his. And he's the guy who rejected Tesla's free energy and created the pay-by-usage nightmare that we all live under today. There he is, J.P. Morgan. He has been connected in literature of the airship mystery of the 1890s as being involved with the financing, possibly connected to NIMSA itself, when NIMSA is discussed in that late 19th century milieu. Again, you've seen him before, but I show you these photos to show you these were real people, okay? John Jacob Astor IV, family patriarch, was German-born. His father, interesting, was a pre-Civil War, I think I might have that wrong, that might be his grandfather, pre-Civil War abolitionist, okay? He was kind of different than his father, a little bit more independent thinking, a little bit more American in his nature and attitudes. Take that for what it's worth. John Jacob Astor himself, the fourth, was a military officer in the Spanish-American War. Interestingly, as I was digging into this, I had learned that he had authored a science fiction novel about an airship traveling to another planet. And he turns up mentioned in the literature of the 1890s airship mystery, as being one of the mysterious New York investors, right, that led people to translate NIMSA to mean New York something or other. Astor IV was the guy who funded a gentleman by the name of John Worrell Keeley, who, Keeley, if you're not familiar with him, was a guy who was a contemporary of Tesla and was working with anti-gravity, okay, in the late 1800s, and apparently making some headway. There was some scandal. Some people called him a fraud, but it was never really proven that he was defrauding anyone. And he was the darling of the spiritualist and theosophist community. Now remember, I was talking about those guys who were industrialists and nationalists, these Germans involved with NIMSA. Well, remember, they were also mystics and very much into esoterica. Well, Keeley was a darling of the theosophists and spiritualists of the late 19th century, who were also very good friends with German mystics of the period. Interestingly enough, Astor IV decided not to fund Tesla. He went with Keeley. What might have happened if it had been the other way around? And of course, John Jacob Astor IV would die on the Titanic. There he is. He's not just a name on a piece of paper. That's him in his younger days. When he died on the Titanic, I think he was 43 or 44, and he had his 20-year-old wife or something. He was just the rich playboy type that liked to have fun, but he was also an inventor. He was also a guy that very much would have been the type to back an airship group. Now, whether American or German, it's hard to tell because of the milieu he moved in. I personally think that Astor was more likely an investor in the American group that had emerged. Then we have this guy, F. Lewis Clark, an industrialist from Maine, and that is what puts him on the radar of this airship mystery, because as you can see, in one of the actual newspaper accounts from the San Francisco Chronicle, a man being interviewed who talks extensively about the mysterious group building and flying these airships of the 1890s, being seen all over the U.S., and also, by the way, heavily in this area here, the local paper, the Bastrop paper, had reported in the 1890s sightings of these airships right over here. Well, in this interview in the San Francisco Chronicle in 1896, the interviewee talks about a mysterious investor from Maine, the state of Maine, who had been out west for some years. And the closest I could come up with was this guy, F. Lewis Clark. And he came up in my other research. He was kind of already there. And he was a mystery because Clark himself allegedly was dying. We're told this. And he disappears from Santa Barbara in 1914. We're told that he kisses his wife goodbye and walks off the end of a pier. And they know this because they found his hat floating in the water. But they never found his body, ever. He's a mystery. I, as you can see, think that he possibly faked his death. And how I learned about this guy was because he, I think, did it again a year later. This is the only known photo that can be found of F. Lewis Clark. I write about in Empire of the Wheel 1 an investigation into occult murder and espionage, that F. Lewis Clark was possibly a gentleman whose remains were found on the side of a hill. The elements had weathered the body so much that it was physically unrecognizable. And the only way we know that body was who they claimed it to be was because in the suit pocket there was his ID, right? So it must be this gentleman named O.H. Bailey, which I don't think was his real name. In my opinion, this Bailey, who was unrecognizable when they found his body, was very possibly F. Lewis Clark's doings and was not the body of Clark. I think Clark faked his death again to disappear forever. You might be looking at the face of a man who actually decided to go off with the breakaway civilization and live wherever it is he lived for however many years after that. But he remains a mystery and was very probably an investor in the American airship group. So let's look at technology. I put this up here to finally make it clear to you what I mean. I've been talking about, what's this 19th century technology, okay, and how does it connect to the 20th century? Well, here you have, here you have the 1850s Arrow by Charles Dellschau, okay? This would be the equivalent of the Model T, right? A rudimentary proof of concept thing, all right? And then the 1890s airship, a little more sophisticated, but kind of like a 58 Buick, okay? Now compare the 58 Buick to the Model T and you see the progression, okay? And then of course we have the famous, I guess that's the S4 model or whatever, and that's a 1985 Porsche. So you can see what I'm talking about here when I say the 19th century thread that connects this airship mystery to the modern technology pretty clearly, I think, with this. And I'll show you that again shortly. So the American group, 1862 to 1865, you had this period involving Solomon Andrews. He demonstrated an airship he designed called the Aeron to reporters of the New York Herald 3 times. He met with Abraham Lincoln, who was so impressed, he ordered Congress and his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, to make a determination on, building these things, acquiring them. And this is all documented, by the way. Andrews was a real guy, and he really met with Lincoln and Stanton, and he really did show this airship. It was not a balloon. It's important to make that distinction. And I want to go back to when I talked about the airship sightings in South America. I wanted to mention that, back then, the way these things were described, they were not balloons. People knew what balloons were in the late 19th century. They knew the difference, and these witnesses never described these things as balloons. Okay? As you can see here, Congress called for the immediate acquisition, but we're told that Edwin Stanton rejected it. But again, like the whole amnesty thing with Butch and Harriman, did Stanton really reject it? There's evidence to suggest he did not, and that the U.S. Secretly began to develop these things. And I have to credit Olaf Phillips for identifying that this was the first black project. I I think it was Olav who said that earlier. This is Solomon Andrews. There he is. He really lived. He was a real guy, okay? So these are the kinds of things you don't hear too much about. This is in the 1860s that this guy demonstrated this flying machine, anti-gravity, so to speak. But then we move on to Colonel Samuel Tillman, a United States Army officer, a chemistry professor. That's important, remember? This guy was a past commander of West Point, okay? You can look him up. Astronomer, engineer, science officer, an explorer of the American Southwest for the U.S. Army, a founding member of the Cosmos Club. Okay, these are the guys that formed the National Geographic Society. And Tillman wrote books on chemistry and geology and such. Okay, there he is, another real guy. Okay, he existed. He had the background that interestingly ties in with the details of this whole airship mystery. Then we have Amos Dolbear, PhD, a doctorate from Wesleyan. He was a professor, okay, at University of Kentucky, Bethany College, Tufts College. Dolbear was a designer and builder of gyroscopes. He worked with resonance and electromagnetism, okay? He was invited to the Paris Expo in 1881 and then the Crystal Palace Exposition in England in 1882. This guy was known and respected very much. He built things that Bell, Marconi, and Hertz were sued by him for because his stuff preceded theirs. The telephone, the wireless, and all this other stuff that Bell, Marconi, and Hertz were famous for. Andrews was working with, Dolbear, Amos Dolbear was working with this stuff already. So what do Tillman and Dolbear have to do with the airship mystery? There's Dolbear. He really lived. He really wore that beard. The Dallas Morning News and the Galveston News in April 1897 reported an airship sighting seen by many people. Okay, it landed at Stephenville. 22 witnesses, including, now a lot of people over the cities saw it, but at the landing there were 22 witnesses interviewed. They included a judge and a senator. We're told that, senators are respectable, but, you can decide that for yourself. The pilots identified themselves as Dolbear and Tillman. Okay, they were allegedly the crew members on this thing, the pilots of it. They said that their expedition was backed by New York capitalists. Talked about those a little earlier, right? It was described as, their craft was described as cigar-shaped, 60 feet long, and had a wheeled apparatus that helped it fly. Remember the thing I showed you from the 1850s that Dellschau drew with the wheels? And they said themselves that it was electric powered. Now this is in 1897, okay? You have two guys with the qualifications that I showed you that they're allegedly flying this thing around openly, showing people, hey, take a look. This is how this works. That's how that works. Then we come to the Wilsons. Now, anybody who has really delved very deeply at all into the airship mystery and some of the strange things with UFOs into the 20th century, you are familiar with the Wilsons. Okay, they are a big mystery themselves. My mentor once told me in the 90s when Wilson first crossed my path, I asked him, who's Wilson? And he said, Wilson is the most brilliant man you've never heard of. And the way he put it too, he said he's the most brilliant man alive. Now, I learned about him when my father had been hospitalized with a blood clot. He was in the Air Force in the 50s, and he was heavily sedated, and he was gibbering about some stuff from his Air Force days. And that's another story, I won't go into it, but he mentioned Wilson this, Wilson that. And that's what prompted me to ask the question. And as I said, that's another whole story. But the Wilsons are in the middle of this airship milieu. Starts with a Tosh Wilson, who Dellschau describes as being in the Sonora Aero Club itself. Okay, so there's a Wilson in the club. Then you have Willard and Hiram, his son, Okay, they were prominently mentioned in the 1897 airship news reports. Okay, and Hiram was even a more brilliant engineer than his father. You have the mysterious Professor Hiram Wilson, who possibly could be the other Hiram Wilson, but more likely maybe his son. And then you have the mysterious Wilson who's involved with the stuff from 1950s to 1990s. So here you have, in what appears to be one family, a bridge, a thread from the 1850s Airship Mystery Club through the 1890s and into the 1990s. Okay, that's a major thread connecting this stuff, the 19th century into the 20th century. Who were they? Who knows? Who are they? There might still be one out there. Let's move on to the technology itself. Here are the arrows again, as depicted by Dellschau, as I showed you. This one here on the right, this shows you it landed, and there it is it's off the ground there, but you can see these arms here, they lift up, and they have to do with maneuvering and lift and such. But this is Dellschau showing you in the 1890s drawing what these things looked like in flight in the 1850s, okay? According to Dellschau, the arrows were powered by a secret powder mixed with water. This liquid product was dripped onto a special drum. The liquid turns to something Peter Menace only referred to as NB gas. This chemical reaction caused the drum to spin, which powered an air compressor, was how he put it, but I don't think it was an air compressor in the sense we think of. And this process or apparatus resulted in lift and propulsion. Okay, that's Dellschau's description of an 1856 aero motor. This is from an article in the Houston Post, the 22nd of April, 1897, in which the pilot Wilson explained that the source of gas supply was in air passed through a condenser containing certain chemicals, the process of which only Wilson knew about. This sounds like the secret that Peter Menace allegedly died and took to the grave, with him. This sounds like the same stuff to me. So we have a Wilson in the Sonora Aero Club in Tosh Wilson, and now we have a Wilson in the 1890s explaining that he's using virtually the same process. But let's look at this. As you can see, there's the drum, okay? There it is again, and this spins. And these little drops here, this is the fuel, the liquid product. It would be dripped slowly on the spinning drum. And you have a spinning drum with a liquid applied to it. I thought, that's kind of familiar. But let's look further. And I came to this, the generator cone. The generator cone was formed using a wire and paste, like you would do almost like paper mache on steroids. And they'd mix these metal fillings, very often copper, okay? And they would take this rawhide and shape it into a particular shape. And they would use this paste, as I said, like paper mache or whatever, over this rawhide, okay? Cut out to a certain shape. And this cone, once it dried and hardened, the way it worked was it spun on a central axis to which it was fitted on the arrow, on the craft, and the secret fuel was applied to it as it was spinning, I think, up through the central axis. And this powered and propelled the arrow. Let's take a look at it. That was drawn by Dellschau in the 1890s. When I saw that, called a generator cone, it has rotation, it has a liquid applied to it. I thought, oh, that sounds familiar. Why could it be? This is what I think the generator cone was, a proof of concept, early rudimentary attempt at the same technology that the Nazis would pursue with the bell. It's even bell-shaped, okay? If it were shaped like a star or a square or a zebra, I could see someone saying, oh, no, that's not anything to do with the bell. But it looks like a duck and quacks like one right there, okay? So, you know, and if you want to go even further, you know, in the post-World War II era, we had the Kecksburg situation, and golly, what did that seem to be? But in my mind, what Kecksburg was, you know, either a captured bell or the captured bell technology, and they were, you know, playing around with it, and it was an American object and such. But I think the thread of connection where they got this stuff started with the Sonora Aero Club and what Menace knew and what they were doing in the 1850s, and through the German NIMSA connection led to the Nazis developing the bell. Okay, the engineers who developed the bell had to get the ideas from somewhere. I mean, it came from, you know, more than one source, but in my opinion, NIMSA was very much involved. NIMSA representatives were very much involved in the development of the Nazi bell. And there you have evidence connected back to a German group, fooling around with the anti-gravity and lift and stuff, the kinds of things that are associated with the Nazi bell. What are we to think about that? So, in the 1890s, we're talking about ship lengths that were, you know, several feet long, in some cases 130 feet. I think there's one mentioned 175 feet long. These worked with geared wheels and flywheels and things. I mean, 65,000 revs per minute. These rapidly revolving spheres, would be part of this, this process. Vibration. There was an aspect of vibration. This is all stuff talked about in the actual witness reports and conversations with the crewmen of the airships. But the vibration, there's one story of an aspect of the technology where the pilot would walk up and just tap a little flangey sticking out. And that vibration would activate the system that would suddenly make the airship buoyant, okay? Anti-gravity, right there. Electric power and batteries were talked about by the crewmen of these 1890s airships. The propellers were described, they were big. They were, you know, 6 feet to 10-foot blades, okay, which made them 12 to 20 feet across the whole thing. All right, and I've always thought it was interesting that there were green and red side lights with a white prow light, which is a lot like our aircraft lighting today, right? And this is in the 1890s, you know, before Kitty Hawk. Okay, and of course, you know, they were talked about as having flown 1,000 miles in 8 hours. Okay, 1890s. There are still people that will tell you these were Zeppelins. Okay. So what was the possible source of their energy, their power? Some people think electrogravitics, the Biefeld-Brown effect of T. Townsend Brown, which I think is being demonstrated out here in the lobby, actually. I saw a model of that. It's essentially, I guess, in layman's terms, anti-gravity as a result of electric field on a mass. Dr. LaViolette wrote in 2008 that electrogravitics was studied by Boeing and the results were classified. And of course, there's rumors that this was used in anti-gravity properties on the B-2 stealth bomber, which of course the government and the officials deny. You know, and it's very possible that electrogravitics is part of it, but I'm leaning more towards this, gravito-electromagnetism. This was a theory published, as you can see, in 1893, just a few years before the airship mysteries of the late 1890s began to be, you know, talked about, these airship sightings, by a gentleman named Oliver Heaviside, I think is Heaviside or Heaviside. Now, look at this. In his theory, gravito-electromagnetism involves counter-rotating wheels producing a greater magnetic attraction than when rotating in the same direction. Okay, those of you familiar with the bell know that it's two elements, one fits inside the other, in counter rotation. okay? And it produced an effect that caused, the bell to lift and fly. So there we're talking about some type of anti-gravity with the bell and its counter-rotating, elements. Here you have in 1893 a guy talking about counter-rotating wheels. And I already showed you the wheel apparatus on that one arrow from the 1850s, and it worked with anti-gravity. Okay. And then we have the toroidal mass rotational aspect, which may be used to accelerate objects without experiencing g-forces. Okay. There is a legend in the airship mystery that in 1908, Tesla was involved in designing an airship that was built that attempted to go to Mars. Okay, we all kind of nod and laugh and say, oh, okay, 1908 to Mars. But when you read something like this, to accelerate objects without experiencing g-forces, if somebody in the 1890s was messing around with that kind of idea, certainly maybe they could have figured out life support systems and how they worked and such. But without experiencing g-forces, that's really interesting. And this is Oliver Heaviside. Again, this guy lived. There's a photo of him, okay? And 1893, he was coming up with this stuff, all right? That's in the heart of the airship mystery era. And yet, as described, you can see how it has its thematic connections to what would come just, 30-some years later in the Bell. And again, I think this guy actually was probably working for the American group, and the Germans took that idea that he had developed. So, again, with the technology thread, I've shown you the arrows of the 1850s. Again, think of them as the Model T, okay, of these anti-gravity contraptions, these things flying around. And 1890s, a little more sophisticated, a little bigger. That's like your 50s Buick. And then your modern UFO, think of it like the 1985 Porsche. The differences in technology between these three automobiles, okay, is, analogous to the difference in the technologies of these. And between this one here in the 1850s and essentially this era here was really only about 100 years or less, okay? So why not? Why do we assume that this modern breakaway secret space program era had to just start with World War II? No. Let's look at the threads. Again, the Germans, 1850s, the whole Prussian effort to unify Germany. This is the era of the Sonora Aero Club, and the NIMSA leads to the era of Kuhn-Loeb and Germans in South America, and then of course that leads to the Second Reich Germany, which leads to the Nazis. You can see the historical progression of the German thread. The money thread, the German bankers and industrialists. You got Kuhn-Loeb again, all the bankers and investors I showed you during the middle to late 19th century era, and then of course they had their connections to Nazi bankers and US bankers. Then in the technology era, you go from the Sonora Aero Club and all the anti-gravity, the stuff we just talked about, okay? Gravito-electromagnetics around since the 1890s. And the 20th century, you have the Nazi bell and anti-gravity. So the breakaway civilization concept was activated, in my opinion, by the mid-19th century. The modern world has been a product and playground of its development for at least 165 years, maybe longer, okay? We must rethink the history within this context. I do want to say that I'm not dismissing any possible ET connection, because obviously when you're talking about organizations that are developing such technology and they might have gone into space, they very likely are going to encounter others who are out there. There is an others aspect to the NIMSA, which I did not go into today. I go into that in my book, Empire of the Wheel 3, The Nameless Ones. Okay? And you'll see how they would connect with this German organization and that. But I want to acknowledge, if you're interested in all this airship stuff, I want to acknowledge the best researchers who came to this before I did, and I owe a lot to these guys. Crenshaw and Navarro. Pete Navarro was the guy who found Dellschau's books in a trash bin of an antique junk shop. He salvaged them. He saved them. We would not have known about Dellschau's stuff if it weren't for Pete Navarro, okay? And he co-wrote a book with Dennis Crenshaw, The Secrets of Dellschau, that I highly recommend. Michael Busby has done an excellent job researching and connecting between the Sonora Aero Club and the 1890s mystery, okay? Theo Pymans, the best book on John Worrell Keeley you'll read, and he gets into the 1890s milieu and all the stuff with Astor and Morgan and Tesla that I referred to. Stephen Romano, I urge you to look up his book, The Art of Charles Dellschau. It is just a beautiful volume, full color, large size pages of Dellschau's art and all these arrows, most of them that he drew. And then, of course, Sean Castile wrote the book on the Tesla airship going to Mars. And, give that some consideration in light of all this. That's where you can, find me and my stuff. And I hope that this wasn't too dry or too confusing. And I know it's, a bunch of new stuff thrown at you guys, or most of you guys. But anyway, I think there's something to it. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Hey, we got you. I can see Isley talking there.
One more time. Thank you, Walter Bosley.
John, turn your head to the right. There you go.